story of the Exodus begins not with a hero, but with a total, systemic identity crush that turned a family into a factory. When the text notes that a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, it signals a deliberate, state-sponsored deletion of history. For 4 centuries, the Israelites were subjected to a mechanism of dehumanization where they were stripped of their names and lineages, categorized solely as units of labor for the Egyptian GDP. In the eyes of the empire, they were not the children of a promise, but a dangerous demographic of brickmakers and field workers. This forced labor wasn't just about building monuments, it was about breaking the soul. By reducing a person's entire worth to their daily quota of bricks, Pharaoh effectively erased their humanity, making the resource easier to exploit once the human element was forgotten. As the generations passed, this external oppression evolved into a profound psychology of erasure. When you are told you are property for 400 years, the chains move from your ankles into your mind. This is the nuance of systemic trauma. The Israelites eventually stopped dreaming of liberty and started dreaming of better rations. Their imagination had shrunk to the size of their survival, a state where a safety in slavery felt more realistic than the risk of freedom. They had been successfully reprogrammed to be cogs in the imperial machine, possessing internal taskmasters that whispered that they were only as valuable as the work they could produce. They were no longer a nation waiting for a rescue, they were a broken people who had lost the ability to even define what rescue looked like. This atmosphere of total erasure reached its peak with the decree of infanticide, an attempt to physically wipe out the future of the people after their past had already been deleted. It is into this darkness that Moses is born, a child who should have been a victim of the erasure but instead is raised within the very palace that ordered it. His life becomes the ultimate paradox. He is an Israelite by blood but an Egyptian by training. However, when he eventually flees to the desert after witnessing the brutality of his people's erasure firsthand, he undergoes a 40-year period of silence that prepares him for the ultimate act of identity recovery. At the burning bush, the silence is finally broken not with a plan for war, but with a genealogy. By invoking the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Creator begins to reverse the erasure by speaking names that had been unspoken for centuries. Moses returns to Egypt not just as a political agitator, but as a mirror. His primary mission is to perform an act of identity recovery before he ever attempts a physical escape. When he stands before the weary, calloused workers, he isn't just giving them a map to a new land, he is showing them a version of themselves they had entirely forgotten. He has to convince a people who believe they are nothing that they are actually royalty. The real crisis wasn't just the physical chains of Pharaoh, but the fact that the people had forgotten they were heirs to a covenant. Moses had to break the mental spell of Egypt first, proving that the first step toward freedom isn't walking out of a gate, but remembering who you were before the world told you who you had to be. Once the mission of identity recovery began, the struggle moved from the hearts of the slaves to the throne room of the empire, evolving into a high-stakes battle of sovereignty. This was not merely a series of random natural disasters, but a systematic deconstruction of the very foundation of Egyptian reality. To understand the weight of this conflict, one must see that Pharaoh was viewed as the Lord of Ma'at, the divine anchor who kept the universe in balance. When Moses demanded the release of the Israelites and Pharaoh responded by asking, "Who is this God that I should obey him?" he wasn't just being stubborn, he was asserting that his empire was the ultimate reality. The 10 plagues that followed were a targeted response to that question, acting as a laboratory of power where the Creator dismantled Egyptian authority piece by piece, proving that the forces of nature, which the Egyptians worshipped as gods, were actually under a higher command. The surgical precision of this divine offensive is revealed in how each plague acted as a direct strike against a specific deity in the Egyptian pantheon, turning the sources of their national pride into instruments of their undoing. When the Nile was turned to blood, it functioned as a public humiliation of Hapi, the god of the river's life-giving silt. When the land was swarmed by frogs or lice, and later when the livestock died, the gods of fertility and protection were shown to be silent and powerless. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, designed to break the spell of the empire. As the plagues progressed, they moved from affecting the economy to affecting the bodies of the people, and finally to the very atmosphere itself. The 3 days of supernatural darkness were a literal shutting down of the sun god, Ra, the supreme deity of Egypt and the supposed father of Pharaoh. By plunging the empire into a darkness that could be felt, the story demonstrates that the light of the world did not belong to the king, but to the one the king refused to acknowledge. This progression leads to the final, devastating break in the system, the 10th plague and the institution of the Passover. This event was the ultimate identity reversal. In the death of the firstborn, the empire that had tried to erase a nation by killing its children now faced the loss of its own future. For the Israelites, the act of painting lamb's blood on their doorposts was a public declaration that they no longer belonged to Pharaoh's system. They were performing a ritual of exiting before they ever stepped foot outside their homes. This night was the birth of a new calendar and a new way of being. They were eating a meal in haste, shoes on their feet and staffs in their hands, signaling that they had finally accepted a life of dangerous freedom. The myth of Pharaoh's invincibility had been deleted, and the people were no longer slaves waiting for permission, but a nation authorized by a higher sovereign. The climax of this deconstruction occurs at the Red Sea, which served as the final gate between the old life and the new. As the Egyptian army pursued them, the Israelites found themselves trapped between the deep water and the elite chariot force of the world's greatest superpower. The sea functioned as the final boundary of their former identity. To move forward, the people had to walk through the very element that symbolized chaos and death. When the waters parted, it wasn't just a path of escape, it was a birth canal for a new nation. When the waters collapsed back onto the Egyptian chariots, it signified the total and irreversible end of Egyptian authority in their lives. The great escape was physically won, but as they stood on the other side singing the Song of the Sea, the narrative shifted. They were now out of Egypt, but the next 40 years would be about the much harder task of getting the Egypt out of them. The transition from the miraculous high of the Red Sea to the grueling silence of the desert introduces the most difficult phase of the Great Escape, the long, slow process of mental deprogramming. While the physical chains were broken in a single night, the internal habits of slavery, the fears, the need for a master, and the avoidance of responsibility remained fully intact. This psychological reality is captured in a repetitive literary pattern known as the wilderness cycle, a sequence of crisis, complaint, and provision that repeats throughout the journey. Within days of their rescue, the people began to grumble, not just about their thirst or hunger, but about the very nature of their freedom. The desert stripped away the operating system of Egypt, and without the predictable, albeit cruel, structure of slavery, the Israelites found themselves in a state of existential panic. The core of this struggle is the phenomenon of safe slavery versus dangerous freedom. In Egypt, the Israelites were property, but they were property that was fed. They knew where their next meal was coming from and what was expected of them. The desert, by contrast, offered total liberty but required absolute trust and personal agency. This created a form of a Stockholm syndrome where, at the first sign of discomfort, the people began to romanticize their time in chains. They famously cried out that they missed the garlic, onions, and leeks of Egypt, conveniently forgetting the whips and the infanticide. This recurring nostalgia for a toxic past reveals that the wilderness is not just a geographic location, but a psychological state of the in-between, the gap where you are no longer who you were, but you aren't yet who you are meant to become. The Creator's response to this grumbling was not immediate punishment, but a steady diet of training through provision. The introduction of manna, the mysterious bread that appeared on the ground every morning, was a daily lesson in deprogramming. The rules for manna were specific. You could only gather enough for one day. If you tried to hoard it, a classic slave behavior driven by a scarcity mindset, it would rot. This forced the people to shift their focus from the stockpiling mentality of Egypt to a rhythm of trust in the present. The desert was acting as a massive classroom where the refugees had to unlearn their reliance on a human tyrant and learn to rely on a divine partner. Every miracle, from water gushing out of a dry rock to a pillar of fire leading them by night, was an attempt to override the old files of fear with a new code of confidence. Ultimately, the wilderness cycle proves that the 18-inch journey from the head to the heart is much longer than the march across the Sinai Peninsula. The physical exit from Egypt was an event, but the internal exit was an education. The story suggests that the reason the journey took 40 years instead of a few weeks was not because the terrain was difficult, but because the people were. They were still carrying Egypt in their minds, and that version of themselves could not survive in the Promised Land. The wilderness was the necessary death of the slave identity, a space where the old generation of survivors had to be transformed into a new generation of pioneers. It serves as a reminder that the path to true change is never a straight line. It is a series of circles where we are forced to face our desire for safe change until we are finally brave enough to be free. The journey reaches its final and most permanent stage not through a change in geography, but through a change in structure. Having dismantled the Egyptian operating system and survived the psychological trials of the desert, the Israelites were still just a group of refugees. To become a nation, they required an internal architecture, a set of values, and a physical center of gravity. This arrived at Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments and the Mosaic Law. In the ancient world, law was usually the arbitrary whim of a tyrant, but here it was presented as the foundation of liberty. These rules established that justice was predictable and that every person, from the elder to the orphan, had inherent rights. This code was the final blow to the slave mentality, replacing the chaos of the wilderness with the order of a civil society where dignity was protected by a standard higher than any human king. The final third of the book focuses on a project that seems, on the surface, to be a tedious manual for construction, the building of the Tabernacle. However, within the context of the Great Escape, the Tabernacle is the ultimate technological breakthrough in the relationship between the people and the divine. Up to this point, encounters with the sacred were terrifying and distant, thunder on a mountain or fire in a bush. The Tabernacle changed the geometry of their lives by moving the divine presence from up there to down here. It was a portable, high-tech palace made of gold, silver, and fine linen, designed to sit at the exact center of the camp. This shift from presence over place meant that the Creator was no longer a destination they had to travel toward, but a partner who lived among them. The divine had effectively moved into a tent, proving that the sacred can coexist with the ordinary, even in the middle of a messy, wandering camp. This construction project was also the first time the people were invited to contribute to something voluntarily. In Egypt, they built monuments for Pharaoh because they were forced to. In the wilderness, they built the tabernacle because their hearts were moved. This was a communal act of healing where they used the gold and jewelry they had carried out of Egypt to create something beautiful for their own future. The tabernacle served as a sacred map, with the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies teaching the people how to approach holiness through order and beauty. It was the physical manifestation of their new identity, no longer a mob of survivors, but a community organized around a central, living truth. The book of Exodus concludes with a powerful visual climax that redefines what it means to arrive. As the tabernacle is completed, the cloud of glory descends and fills the structure, and the pillar of fire rests upon it. Interestingly, the book does not end with the people entering the promised land. They are still in the desert, surrounded by sand and uncertainty. Yet, the story treats this as a successful conclusion because the presence has arrived. The lesson is that the goal of freedom was never just about a change in location, but about a change in atmosphere. They had finally built a space within themselves and their community where the divine could dwell. It tells us that you are truly free not when you reach your destination, but when you have learned to carry the truth with you into the unknown. The true weight of the Exodus story lies in the uncomfortable realization that leaving is easy, but changing is hard. We often celebrate the Red Sea moments of our lives, the day we quit the toxic job, the night we walked away from the bad relationship, or the moment we decided to break an addiction. These are cinematic, high-energy wins. But Exodus warns us that the physical exit is only the first 1% of the journey. The remaining 99% happens in the in-between, that long, dusty stretch of the wilderness where the adrenaline of the escape has worn off, and you are left alone with the person you used to be. The identity crush of Egypt created a version of us that is addicted to certainty, even if that certainty is painful. This is why we romanticize our old chains the moment the new path gets difficult. We mistake the discomfort of growth for the sign of a mistake. We think, maybe it wasn't that bad back there, because at least back there, we knew who we were. The wilderness feels like wasted time, but the narrative shows us it is actually the incubation period. You cannot handle the promised land while you still have a slave mindset. If you were given everything you wanted while you were still mentally in Egypt, you would just turn your new home into a new prison. This leads to the final, most profound lesson: the destination is a distraction, the presence is the point. We spend our lives waiting for the land of milk and honey, the perfect house, the perfect career, the moment we finally arrive. But Exodus ends with the people still in the sand. It suggests that arriving isn't about a change in scenery, but a change in who is at the center of your camp. When the tabernacle was finished, the desert was still a desert, but the atmosphere had changed because the truth was now in the middle of the mess. The reflection for anyone in their own wilderness right now is this: stop looking at the horizon and start looking at your camp. The law and the tabernacle weren't about getting to a border, they were about building a version of yourself that can be free anywhere. Freedom isn't the absence of a desert, it's the presence of a purpose that is bigger than the desert. Your in-between isn't a detour, it is the forge. You aren't lost, you are being deprogrammed, restructured, and prepared for a version of life that your Egypt self couldn't even imagine.